The saloon doors swung open with a crash that silenced every conversation in the room. Jake Morgan stood in the doorway, dust coating his leather boots and the late afternoon sun casting his shadow across the wooden floor like a dark promise. He was everything the women of Redemption Creek whispered about during their afternoon teas: tall, broad-shouldered, with eyes the color of stormy skies and a jaw that looked carved from granite. His reputation had arrived 3 days before he did, carried by travelers who spoke of the legendary gunslinger who had never lost a draw and never stayed in one town longer than a season. Sheriff Thomas Bennett looked up from his card game, a slow smile spreading across his weathered face. He was a man who had seen 40 winters, with silver threading through his dark hair and scars that told stories he rarely shared. The two men locked eyes, and something unspoken passed between them, recognition, perhaps, or the acknowledgement that this town wasn't big enough for both their egos. "Heard you were coming," Bennett said, setting down his cards with deliberate care. "Heard a lot of things about Jake Morgan. Heard you're faster than lightning and twice as deadly. Heard women throw themselves at your feet in every town you pass through." Jake moved to the bar with the fluid grace of a predator, his spurs jingling softly with each step. "I don't put much stock in talk, Sheriff. Actions speak louder." The sheriff stood, his chair scraping against the floor. The other card players scattered like tumbleweeds in a strong wind, sensing the tension crackling in the air like electricity before a storm. Bennett approached the bar, standing close enough that Jake could smell the whiskey on his breath and see the challenge burning in his eyes. "I'll make you a wager," Bennett said, his voice carrying through the silent saloon. "You think you're God's gift to women, Morgan? You think that pretty face of yours opens every door? I say you're nothing special. I say any man with real character could win over the finest woman in this town, regardless of what he looks like." Jake turned, leaning back against the bar with an amused expression. "That's so? What exactly are you proposing, Sheriff?" Bennett's smile widened, showing teeth. "Simple bet. Tomorrow at noon, right here in this saloon, I'll give you a choice. You can pick any unmarried woman in Redemption Creek, anyone you want. Then you'll have 1 month to court her, win her heart, and get her to agree to marry you. No tricks, no lies, no using your reputation. Just honest courting." "And what do you get out of this?" Jake asked, though his interest was clearly piqued. "If you fail, you leave town and never come back. If you succeed, I'll give you my badge and leave myself. But here's the catch, I get to set one condition on who you choose. You game?" Jake studied the sheriff's face, looking for the trap he knew must be hidden somewhere in those words. Pride was a powerful thing, and his had been challenged in front of half the town. Men were already whispering, and he could feel their eyes on him, weighing his response. He thought about the women he'd known in other towns, how easy they'd made it, how they'd swooned at his smile and melted at his touch. 1 month seemed like an eternity for such a simple task. "What's the condition?" Jake asked carefully. Bennett's eyes gleamed with something that might have been victory or might have been mischief. "You don't get to know until tomorrow at noon. That's when you make your choice, and that's when I tell you my terms. But whatever I say, you have to honor the bet. Your word against mine, witnessed by everyone in this room." The saloon held its breath. Jake felt the weight of every stare, every expectation. He was a gambling man by nature, and this was the ultimate gamble: his pride, his reputation, everything he'd built his identity upon, all riding on his ability to charm one woman in 30 days. He extended his hand. "You've got yourself a bet, Sheriff." Their hands clasped, and the deal was sealed. The saloon erupted in excited chatter, men already placing side bets and speculating on who Jake might choose. Would it be Margaret Sullivan, the beautiful school teacher with honey-colored hair? Or perhaps Emma Rodriguez, the rancher's daughter whose grace and elegance had half the county's bachelors composing terrible poetry? Jake finished his whiskey in one smooth motion, confident and unconcerned. He'd faced down armed men without flinching. How hard could winning over one woman possibly be? As he headed upstairs to the room he'd rented, he didn't notice the satisfied look on Sheriff Bennett's face, or the way several townspeople exchanged knowing glances. He didn't know that he'd just walked into a trap more dangerous than any gunfight he'd ever faced, and that tomorrow at noon, his entire world was about to shift on its axis in ways he couldn't possibly imagine. Noon came with a blazing sun that turned Redemption Creek's main street into a shimmering ribbon of heat and dust. The saloon was packed tighter than a Sunday church service, with bodies pressed against walls and necks craning for a better view. Word had spread like wildfire, and it seemed every soul within 10 miles had found a reason to be in town today. Women whispered behind their fans, men elbowed each other with knowing grins, and even the children sensed something momentous was about to unfold. Jake Morgan descended the stairs with the confidence of a man who'd never known defeat. He'd spent the morning washing up, shaving carefully, and selecting his finest shirt, black with silver buttons that caught the light. He'd mentally reviewed every unmarried woman in town, weighing options like a general planning a campaign. Margaret Sullivan seemed the obvious choice, educated, beautiful, from a good family. Or perhaps Emma Rodriguez, whose father's ranch was the largest in 3 counties. Either would be a prize worth winning, and neither would require much effort from a man of his considerable charms. Sheriff Bennett stood at the center of the room, arms crossed, looking like a man holding 4 aces and a straight flush. Beside him stood Deputy Marshal Crawford, there to witness the proceedings and ensure both men honored their word. The crowd parted as Jake approached, and the murmur of conversation died to absolute silence. "Ready to make your choice, Morgan?" Bennett asked, his voice carrying that same amused tone from yesterday. "More than ready," Jake replied smoothly. "I've been thinking about this all morning." Bennett gestured toward the crowd. "Then look around. Every unmarried woman in Redemption Creek is here today. Some came curious, some came hopeful, some came just to watch you make a fool of yourself. Take your time. Look them all over. Pick the one you want." Jake's eyes swept the room, noting the faces he'd expected to see. Margaret stood near the window, her posture perfect, golden hair gleaming in the sunlight streaming through the glass. Emma leaned against the far wall, dark eyes watching him with barely concealed interest. Sarah Chen, the apothecary's daughter, sat at a corner table, intelligent and composed. Rachel Murphy, Victoria James, Catherine O'Brien, each one a potential victory, each one a path to winning this ridiculous bet. His gaze traveled across the assembled women, cataloging beauty and status like a merchant taking inventory. Then his eyes fell on someone he hadn't noticed before, someone standing in the shadows near the kitchen door, almost as if she was trying to disappear into the wall itself. Beatrice Wilson was not like the other women. Where they wore their finest dresses in hopes of catching his attention, she wore a simple brown frock that had been mended at the elbows. Where they stood with confidence or coy anticipation, she seemed to be fighting the urge to flee. She was a large woman, her body soft and round in a world that prized delicate frames and tiny waists. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her face, round-cheeked and gentle, was turned slightly away, as if even being in this room caused her pain. Jake dismissed her immediately and returned his attention to the real options. "Margaret Sullivan," he announced clearly. "I choose the school teacher." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Margaret's face flushed with pleasure, and several women nearby congratulated her with barely concealed envy. Sheriff Bennett, however, simply shook his head, that infuriating smile growing wider. "Not so fast, Morgan. I said you could pick any woman you wanted. And you did. But I also said I had one condition, remember?" Jake felt the first flutter of unease in his gut. "What condition?" Bennett turned to face the crowd, his voice ringing with authority. "The condition is this: whatever woman Jake Morgan chooses, he has to court the exact opposite." He said he wanted Margaret Sullivan, the beautiful school teacher that every man in town admires? Fine. Then he gets to court Beatrice Wilson instead. The saloon exploded with reactions. Some people gasped, others laughed, and more than a few looked at the sheriff with something approaching horror. Jake felt as if he'd been punched in the stomach. That wasn't the deal. "Yes, it was," Bennett said calmly. "I said I'd let you pick any woman you wanted, and then I'd set one condition. My condition is that you court the opposite of your choice. You wanted the town beauty? You get the woman everyone overlooks. You wanted privilege and status? You get the daughter of a washerwoman who barely scrapes by. You wanted easy? You get impossible. That's the bet, Morgan. Those were the terms you agreed to. Unless you're backing out." Jake's mind raced, searching for an escape. But Deputy Marshal Crawford stepped forward, his expression stern. "I witnessed the bet myself, Morgan. The sheriff's terms are clear, and you gave your word in front of this whole town. You walk away now, and you're nothing but a coward who can't keep his promises." Every eye in the room fixed on Jake, waiting for his response. His pride warred with his common sense. This was absurd, impossible. He couldn't court Beatrice Wilson. She was invisible, insignificant, nothing like the women who usually sought his attention. What would people say? What would people think? But walking away would be worse. His reputation would be destroyed, his word meaningless. He'd be laughed out of every town from here to the Mexican border. Slowly, he turned to look at Beatrice again. She stood frozen in the shadows, her face pale with shock and something that looked like pure terror. Her hands twisted together in front of her apron, and he could see them trembling from across the room. She looked like she wanted the earth to open up and swallow her whole. For just a moment, Jake felt an unexpected surge of something that might have been sympathy or might have been shame. He took a deep breath and straightened his shoulders. Fine. I accept the terms. Beatrice Wilson, I'll be courting you for the next 30 days. The crowd erupted again, but Jake barely heard them. He watched Beatrice's face cycle through emotions: shock, disbelief, fear, and finally something that looked heartbreakingly close to despair. She didn't look flattered or excited or even curious. She looked like a woman who'd just been sentenced to a month of public humiliation, and Jake realized with uncomfortable clarity that she probably had been. 3 days passed before Jake worked up the courage to approach Beatrice properly. He'd seen her around town, always moving quickly with her eyes down, always taking the back alleys and side streets, always trying to be invisible. It wasn't hard to understand why. The whole town was buzzing with gossip about the bet, and Beatrice had become the unwilling center of attention she'd clearly spent her entire life avoiding. He found her where Sheriff Bennett said he would, at the creek on the edge of town, washing laundry for Mrs. Hendricks and the other wealthy families who could afford to pay someone else to do their scrubbing. The morning sun was already hot, and Beatrice was bent over a washboard, her sleeves rolled up to her elbows, her back to the path. Beside her sat 3 large baskets of dirty linens, and Jake realized with a sinking feeling that she'd probably been working since dawn. "Miss Wilson," he called out, keeping his distance so as not to startle her. She froze, her hands stilling in the soapy water. For a long moment, she didn't turn around, and Jake wondered if she was hoping he'd simply go away if she ignored him long enough. Finally, she straightened slowly, wiping her wet hands on her apron before turning to face him. Her expression was carefully neutral, giving nothing away. "Mr. Morgan," she said quietly. Her voice was softer than he'd expected, with a gentle quality that didn't match the defensive set of her shoulders. "I thought we might talk," Jake said, suddenly feeling as awkward as a schoolboy. "About the situation." "The situation," Beatrice repeated, and there was the faintest edge to her tone. "Is that what we're calling it? I would have used different words. Public humiliation, perhaps. Cruel joke. Entertainment for bored townsfolk." Jake flinched at the accuracy of her assessment. "I know this isn't ideal for either of us." "Don't," she interrupted, her voice still quiet but firm. "Please don't pretend this is equally difficult for both of us. You're the one everyone admires. You're the handsome gunslinger with the legendary reputation. If you lose this bet, you ride out of town and start fresh somewhere else, probably with an even better story to tell. But me? I'm the woman who was so undesirable that courting me was used as punishment. I'm the joke that will follow me for the rest of my life." The words hit Jake like physical blows. He'd been so caught up in his own bruised pride, his own wounded ego, that he hadn't truly considered what this meant for her. He watched as Beatrice turned back to her washing, her movements jerky with suppressed emotion. "I'm sorry," he said, meaning it. "You're right. I didn't think about how this would affect you." "No one ever does," Beatrice murmured, scrubbing at a stain with more force than necessary. "I've spent 26 years being invisible in this town, Mr. Morgan. I'm the fat girl who does laundry and helps her mother clean houses. I'm the one men look through like I'm made of glass. I'm the one women pity when they're feeling charitable and ignore when they're not. And now, thanks to your stupid bet with the sheriff, I'm the laughingstock of Redemption Creek." Jake sat down on a nearby rock, watching her work. "Why did the sheriff choose you specifically? There must be a reason." Beatrice laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You'd have to ask him. Maybe because he knew it would be the hardest challenge for someone like you. Maybe because he wanted to prove a point about vanity and pride. Or maybe he just wanted to remind everyone in town that I exist, even if it's for all the wrong reasons." "Tell me about yourself," Jake said suddenly. "Really tell me. Not what the town thinks or what you do for work. Who are you when no one's watching?" She paused, her hands stilling in the water again. "Why would you possibly care?" "Because I made a promise to court you, and I keep my promises. But more than that, because I'm starting to realize I've been a fool. Sheriff Bennett didn't just trap me in a bet, he held up a mirror, and I don't much like what I'm seeing in it." Beatrice turned to study him, her hazel eyes searching his face for signs of mockery or deception. Whatever she found there must have satisfied her, because she sat back on her heels and sighed deeply. "I'm nobody special, Mr. Morgan. My father died when I was 12, leaving my mother and me with nothing but debts. We've worked ever since to keep a roof over our heads. I take in washing because it's honest work and because it lets me be alone with my thoughts. I'm not educated like Margaret Sullivan or refined like Emma Rodriguez. I've never been to a fancy ball or worn a dress that wasn't made from someone else's cast-offs. I read books borrowed from the library when I can, and I watch the stars at night when the work is done. That's all I am, a woman trying to get by in a world that decided long ago that I don't matter. The raw honesty in her words struck something deep in Jake's chest. He'd spent years collecting conquests like trophies, charming women with practiced ease, moving from town to town without ever really seeing the people he left behind. Beatrice Wilson, with her rough hands and mended dress and eyes full of hurt, was more real than anyone he'd encountered in years. What if we made a deal of our own? Jake proposed carefully. A different kind than the one I made with the sheriff. Beatrice raised an eyebrow. I'm listening. You're right that this whole situation is unfair to you. You're right that I was thoughtless and vain. But we're stuck with each other for the next 27 days. So here's my proposal. I'll court you properly, the way a woman deserves to be courted. No half measures, no going through the motions. And in exchange, you let me prove that I can be better than the person I've been. If at the end of the month you still can't stand the sight of me, I'll tell the whole town that the bet is off and that you rejected me. Your choice, your terms. Why would you do that? Beatrice asked suspiciously. You'd lose everything, your pride, your reputation, your bet with the sheriff. Jake stood and moved closer, close enough to see the flecks of gold in her hazel eyes and the way the sun caught in her dark hair. Maybe I'm tired of being the person everyone expects me to be. Maybe I want to know what it's like to connect with someone real. Or maybe I just want to prove to myself that I'm capable of more than empty charm and hollow victories. Beatrice studied him for a long moment, and Jake found himself holding his breath, waiting for her verdict. Finally, she nodded slowly. All right, Mr. Morgan. We'll try it your way. But understand this, I won't make it easy for you, and I won't pretend to be something I'm not. If you're going to court me, you're going to court the real me, with all my flaws and imperfections. I wouldn't have it any other way, Jake said, and surprised himself by meaning it. As he walked back toward town, leaving Beatrice to her washing, Jake felt something shift inside him. This was going to be harder than any challenge he'd ever faced, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was doing something that actually mattered. He didn't know yet if he could win Beatrice's heart, but he was determined to try, not for the bet, not for his pride, but because she deserved someone who saw her for who she really was. Jake Morgan had courted dozens of women in his 30 years, but he'd never worked as hard as he did in those next 2 weeks with Beatrice Wilson. Every assumption he'd made about romance had to be thrown out and rebuilt from scratch. The practiced smiles and smooth words that had opened doors in other towns fell flat here. Beatrice saw through them instantly, her eyes narrowing with disappointment whenever he slipped into old habits. So he learned to be genuine instead, and it was terrifying. He started by showing up at the creek every morning to help her carry the heavy baskets of wet laundry back to the lines behind Mrs. Hendrick's house. The first time, Beatrice had tried to refuse, insisting she didn't need help. But Jake had simply picked up 2 baskets and started walking, leaving her no choice but to follow with the third. It became their routine, working side by side in the early morning light, talking about everything and nothing. Tell me about the places you've been, Beatrice asked one morning as they hung sheets on the line, the fabric snapping in the breeze like white sails. Jake found himself describing towns and landscapes, but not with the bragging tone he usually employed. Instead, he talked about the loneliness of constant travel, the emptiness of never putting down roots, the way every town started to blur together after a while. Beatrice listened with an intensity that made him want to tell her things he'd never told anyone. Sounds exhausting, she said finally. Always moving, never belonging anywhere. Don't you ever want to stop? I never did before, Jake admitted, handing her a clothespin. But lately I've been wondering what I'm running from. In the afternoons, he'd find reasons to be wherever she was working. If she was scrubbing floors at the Mercantile, he'd show up with cold lemonade and sit on the steps, reading aloud from the newspaper while she worked. If she was mending clothes for the seamstress, he'd sit nearby and learn to thread needles, his large hands clumsy with the delicate work. The townspeople watched with undisguised fascination, their gossip shifting from mockery to grudging curiosity. Beatrice never made it easy. She questioned his motives constantly, tested his sincerity, and refused to be charmed by anything that felt superficial. When he brought her wildflowers, she asked him to name each variety and explain why he'd chosen them. When he complimented her appearance, she wanted specifics, not empty flattery but genuine observations. She demanded honesty, and Jake found himself giving it, even when it made him vulnerable. Why do you wear your gun all the time? she asked one evening as they walked along the creek. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, and fireflies were beginning to dance above the water. Jake's hand moved instinctively to the revolver at his hip. Protection, I suppose. Reputation. It's who I am. Is it? Beatrice stopped walking and turned to face him. Or is it armor? A way to keep people at a distance, to make sure they see the gunslinger before they see the man. The insight cut deep, and Jake felt something crack in his chest. Maybe both, he said quietly. When you're known for being dangerous, people treat you with respect even if they don't like you. It's easier than trying to earn genuine regard. Respect based on fear isn't respect at all, Beatrice said gently. It's just another form of loneliness. They sat by the creek until the stars came out, and Jake talked about his childhood, the father who'd abandoned them, the mother who'd worked herself to death, the anger that had driven him to become fast with a gun. Beatrice shared her own stories of loss and struggle, of learning to be invisible because being seen only brought pain. In the darkness, with the sound of water flowing over rocks, they found a strange kind of peace in their shared understanding of what it meant to build walls around your heart. The turning point came during the town's summer social, a dance held in the community hall that everyone was expected to attend. Jake had been dreading it, knowing that appearing publicly with Beatrice would invite scrutiny and commentary. But when he arrived at her small house to escort her, he found her wearing a dress she'd made herself, deep blue fabric that she'd somehow acquired and stitched late at night after finishing her regular work. It wasn't fancy or fashionable, but it fit her well and brought out the color of her eyes. "You look beautiful," Jake said, and meant it with an intensity that surprised them both. Beatrice blushed and looked away. "You don't have to say that." "I'm not saying it because I have to," Jake replied firmly. "I'm saying it because it's true. You are beautiful, Beatrice. Not despite who you are, but because of it. You're kind and intelligent and honest. You work harder than anyone I've ever met. You see through pretense and value substance. Any man would be lucky to court you." Tears sprang to Beatrice's eyes, and she blinked them back quickly. "Stop it. You're going to make me ruin my face powder." At the dance, Jake led Beatrice onto the floor with his head held high, ignoring the whispers and stares. She was stiff with nervousness at first, stumbling over her own feet and apologizing constantly. But Jake held her steady, moving slowly until she found the rhythm, and gradually she relaxed in his arms. He discovered that she was actually a good dancer when she wasn't paralyzed by self-consciousness, and he told her so, watching her face light up with pleasure. Margaret Sullivan danced past with William Carter, the bank manager's son, and Jake realized with some surprise that he felt no regret about his choice. Margaret was lovely, certainly, but she was also predictable and shallow. She would have required nothing from him except his appearance and reputation. Beatrice demanded everything: his honesty, his vulnerability, his best self. It was exhausting and exhilarating and utterly unlike anything he'd experienced before. As the evening wore on, Jake noticed something shifting in the room. People were watching them differently now, with less mockery and more interest. Beatrice's genuine smile and Jake's obvious attentiveness were hard to dismiss as mere performance. Several women who'd never spoken to Beatrice before approached to compliment her dress. A few men clapped Jake on the shoulder and told him he'd done well. It wasn't universal acceptance, but it was a start. When Jake walked Beatrice home that night, they stopped on her porch under a sky full of stars. The air was warm and smelled of honeysuckle, and Jake could hear crickets singing in the grass. "Thank you," Beatrice said softly. "For tonight. For the past 2 weeks. For treating me like I matter." "You do matter," Jake replied, taking her hands in his. "I'm starting to think you might be the most remarkable person I've ever met." Beatrice laughed, but there was emotion in it. "I'm not remarkable. I'm just ordinary." "No," Jake said firmly. "You're extraordinary. You've survived hardship that would break most people. You've maintained your kindness despite being treated badly. You've kept your hope alive even when the world gave you every reason to give up. That's not ordinary, Beatrice. That's heroic." She looked up at him, her hazel eyes searching his face in the moonlight. "What happens in 2 weeks when the bet ends? When you've won or lost and there's no more reason to pretend?" Jake's heart hammered in his chest. "What if I don't want it to end? What if this stopped being about the bet somewhere along the way?" "Jake." Beatrice's voice was barely a whisper. He cupped her face gently, giving her every opportunity to pull away. When she didn't, when she leaned into his touch instead, he kissed her softly, carefully, as if she were something precious that might break. She tasted like punch and possibility, and when they finally parted, Jake knew with absolute certainty that he'd been falling in love with her without even realizing it. 2 more weeks, Beatrice said shakily. Let's see where we are then. The final 2 weeks should have been perfect, but trouble came calling in the form of Jake's past. A telegram arrived at the sheriff's office on a Tuesday morning, carried by a rider who looked like he'd pushed his horse to the limits. Sheriff Bennett read it twice before walking grimly to find Jake, who was helping Beatrice hang laundry as had become their morning custom. "Morgan," Bennett called out, his tone serious enough that both Jake and Beatrice stopped working immediately. "We need to talk. Privately." Jake followed the sheriff away from the creek, dread settling in his stomach like a stone. Bennett handed him the telegram without preamble. Jake read it, and the blood drained from his face. The message was from a town 300 miles east, the last place Jake had spent any significant time before drifting to Redemption Creek. It informed Sheriff Bennett that Jake Morgan was wanted for questioning in connection with a shooting death. A man named Robert Thornton had been killed in a saloon fight, and several witnesses claimed Jake had pulled his gun first. The telegram requested that Jake be held until marshals could arrive to transport him back for trial. "This true?" Bennett asked, his hand resting on his own weapon. "There was a fight," Jake admitted, his voice hoarse. "Thornton accused me of cheating at cards. He drew first, Bennett, I swear it. I only defended myself. But Thornton's father is a wealthy rancher who owns half the county. I knew I'd never get a fair trial, so I left town." "You ran," Bennett corrected. "Making you look guilty as sin." Jake ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. "What happens now?" "Now I have to lock you up until the marshals arrive," Bennett said, though he looked troubled. "Could be a week, could be 2. And Jake? If you're convicted of murder, that bet we made won't mean much. You'll hang." The word hung between them like a death sentence. Jake thought of Beatrice, of the life he'd been starting to imagine with her, of everything he'd found in Redemption Creek that he'd been missing for years. The cruel irony wasn't lost on him, he'd finally found something worth staying for, and his past was dragging him away. "Can I at least talk to her first?" "Explain?" Bennett hesitated, then nodded. "You've got an hour. Then you're coming in voluntarily, or I'll bring you in by force." Jake walked back to the creek on leaden legs. Beatrice took one look at his face and dropped the sheet she'd been holding. "What's wrong?" He told her everything, the fight, the death, the accusation, the fact that he'd be locked up and possibly sent to his execution. Beatrice listened in silence, her face growing paler with each word. When he finished, she sat down heavily on the grass, as if her legs wouldn't hold her anymore. "You were running," she said quietly. "When you came here, you were running from this." "Yes," Jake admitted. "There was no point in lying now. I was running, and I planned to keep running. But then I met you, and everything changed. Beatrice, these past weeks with you have been the most real, most honest, most meaningful time of my entire life. I wasn't pretending anymore. I wasn't performing. I was just me. And for the first time, that felt like enough." Tears spilled down Beatrice's cheeks. "Did you kill him? Tell me the truth, Jake. Did you shoot first?" Jake knelt in front of her, taking her hands. "No. He drew first. I was faster, and my aim was better. But I didn't start it, and I didn't want it. Sometimes being fast with a gun means you live while someone else dies, even when you wish there'd been another way." Beatrice studied his face for a long moment, and Jake felt as if she were looking straight into his soul, weighing every truth and lie he'd ever told. Finally, she spoke. "I believe you." The simple declaration nearly broke Jake's heart. "You shouldn't. You barely know me." "I know enough," Beatrice said firmly, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "I know you've been honest with me for weeks now. I know you've been kind and patient and genuine. I know that the man who shoots first in bar fights isn't the same man who learns to thread needles and carries laundry baskets and listens to boring stories about my childhood. People change, Jake. You've changed." "Maybe," Jake said. "But that doesn't matter if I hang for something I did when I was different." Beatrice stood abruptly, her jaw set with determination. "Then we fight. We find witnesses, we gather evidence, we tell your side of the story. We don't just give up." "Beatrice." "No," she interrupted, her voice strong despite the tears still on her face. "You spent weeks teaching me that I'm worth fighting for, Jake Morgan. Well, now it's my turn. You're worth fighting for too. We'll find a way through this." The hour passed too quickly. Jake surrendered himself to Sheriff Bennett's custody, and the cell door clanged shut with a finality that echoed in his bones. Beatrice visited every day, bringing him meals and books and sitting outside his cell to talk through the bars. She enlisted help from unexpected sources: Deputy Marshal Crawford, who'd witnessed Jake's character during the courting period; Margaret Sullivan, who despite her initial disappointment had come to respect Jake's treatment of Beatrice; even Emma Rodriguez, whose father had connections throughout the territory. They discovered that several other people had left Thornton's town around the same time Jake did, all of them also fleeing the Thornton family's influence. Two of them were willing to testify that Robert Thornton had a reputation for starting fights and that his father regularly used his power to ensure his son faced no consequences. It wasn't much, but it was something. When the marshals finally arrived, they came with news that changed everything. One of the witnesses who'd originally testified against Jake had recanted his statement, admitting that Thornton's father had paid him to lie. An investigation had been opened into the Thornton family's business practices, revealing a pattern of corruption and intimidation. The case against Jake was being dropped, though he'd still need to return to give a formal statement. Jake emerged from his cell into brilliant sunshine, blinking against the brightness. Beatrice was waiting on the steps of the sheriff's office, and when she saw him, her face transformed with joy. He didn't walk to her, he ran, scooping her up in his arms and spinning her around while she laughed and cried simultaneously. "It's over," he said, burying his face in her hair. "It's really over. What will you do now?" Beatrice asked when he finally set her down. "The bet ends tomorrow. You're free to go wherever you want." Jake looked around at Redemption Creek, the dusty streets he'd come to know, the people who'd watched his transformation, the woman who'd somehow seen past everything he'd pretended to be and found the person he actually was underneath. He thought about the life he'd been living before, always moving, never connecting, constantly running from something or toward something but never just being. "I'm staying," he said simply. "If you'll have me. Not because of a bet, not because I have to, but because this is where I want to be. You're who I want to be with." These past weeks showed me what my life was missing: purpose, connection, someone who challenges me to be better. I love you, Beatrice Wilson. Not because you're easy to love, but because loving you made me into someone worth being. Beatrice's eyes filled with fresh tears, but she was smiling through them. "I love you too, you impossible, stubborn, wonderful man. Yes, I'll have you. But on one condition." "Anything," Jake promised. "You hang up that gun," Beatrice said firmly. "Not because I want to change who you are, but because I want a future with you that doesn't involve wondering if each day might be your last. You're more than your reputation, Jake. You're more than being the fastest drawer in the territory. Be the man I've come to know, the one who carries laundry baskets and reads newspapers and isn't afraid to be vulnerable." Jake looked down at the weapon he'd worn for over a decade, the thing that had defined him for so long. Then he unbuckled the gun belt and handed it to Sheriff Bennett without hesitation. "Hold on to this for me, will you? I don't think I'll be needing it anymore." Bennett took the gun belt with a knowing smile. "About that bet we made, Morgan." "I forfeit," Jake interrupted. "You win. I'm not leaving town, and I'm not taking your badge. This was never about winning or losing anyway, was it?" "No," Bennett admitted. "It was about teaching a prideful man a lesson. You came into my town thinking you were God's gift to women, thinking your looks and reputation made you better than everyone else. I wanted to show you that real worth comes from character, not appearance. That the most valuable people are often the ones we overlook. And I wanted to give Beatrice here a chance to be seen for once, truly seen, by someone who needed to learn how to look past the surface." "You used both of us," Jake said, but there was no anger in his voice, only understanding. "I gave both of you an opportunity," Bennett corrected. "What you did with it was entirely up to you. You could have gone through the motions, fulfilled the letter of the bet without honoring its spirit. Instead, you chose to open your heart. That was all you, Morgan." The next day, the entire town gathered to witness the resolution of the famous bet. But instead of a winner being declared, they witnessed something far more meaningful. Jake stood before the crowd with Beatrice beside him, their hands clasped together, and announced their engagement. The townspeople erupted in cheers and applause, their initial skepticism transformed into genuine happiness for the unlikely couple. Margaret Sullivan approached Beatrice afterward, her expression sincere. "I judged you unfairly for years," she said quietly. "I treated you as if you were invisible because you didn't fit what I thought mattered. I'm sorry for that, and I'm happy for you both." Others followed with similar sentiments. Emma Rodriguez invited Beatrice to join the ladies' book club. Mrs. Hendricks offered to host their wedding reception. Even the people who'd mocked Beatrice most cruelly seemed to recognize that something extraordinary had happened, that two people had found each other despite every obstacle and expectation working against them. In the weeks that followed, Jake found work as a carpenter's apprentice, discovering he had a talent for building things rather than destroying them. Beatrice continued her laundry business, but now with Jake's help, she was able to take on fewer clients and spend more time on the sewing she truly enjoyed. They moved into a small house on the edge of town, nothing fancy but entirely theirs, and began building a life together based on mutual respect and genuine affection. Sheriff Bennett stopped by one evening, finding them on their porch watching the sunset. "I wanted to apologize," he said, settling into a rocking chair. "I manipulated both of you for what I thought were good reasons, but manipulation is still manipulation. You didn't deserve to be pawns in my lesson." Jake shook his head. "You gave me the greatest gift anyone ever has. You forced me to become someone worth loving. Without your interference, I'd have ridden through town, maybe charmed Margaret Sullivan or Emma Rodriguez, and moved on without ever realizing what I was missing. You saved me from myself, Bennett. And you gave me something I never thought I'd have," Beatrice added softly. "You gave me visibility, yes, but more than that, you gave me Jake. You gave me proof that I'm worthy of love, that my size doesn't define my value, that someone could look at me and see not what the world sees but who I actually am." Bennett smiled, satisfied. "Then maybe it all worked out the way it was supposed to. Just promise me one thing. When you tell your children this story someday, maybe leave out the part about how their parents met because of a bet." They laughed together as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Jake wrapped his arm around Beatrice's shoulders, marveling at how perfectly she fit against his side, how right this felt. He'd traveled countless miles searching for something he couldn't name, only to find it in the last place he'd expected, in a small town, with a woman everyone overlooked, in a love born from an impossible challenge. Months later, on a crisp autumn day, Jake and Beatrice were married under an oak tree on the edge of town. The entire population of Redemption Creek attended, witnessing the union of the gunslinger who'd learned to be gentle and the invisible woman who'd taught him how to truly see. As Jake kissed his bride, he realized that winning Beatrice's heart hadn't been about fulfilling a bet or proving his charm. It had been about stripping away everything false until only truth remained, about learning that real love requires vulnerability, that true beauty comes from within, and that the most valuable things in life are often the ones we almost miss because we're looking in the wrong direction. Sheriff Bennett stood at the back of the crowd, watching the celebration with quiet satisfaction. He'd gambled on human nature and won, not because he'd forced anyone to change but because he'd created circumstances where change became possible. Jake Morgan had arrived in Redemption Creek as a man running from his past, defined by his gun and his appearance. He remained as a man running toward his future, defined by his character and his heart. And Beatrice Wilson, who'd spent 26 years invisible, who'd accepted her place in the shadows because the world told her that's where she belonged, stood in the center of everyone's attention wearing a wedding dress she'd sewn herself, radiant with the confidence that comes from being truly loved. She'd learned that she didn't need to change to deserve happiness, she only needed someone willing to see her clearly. As the sun set on their wedding day and the celebration continued into the evening, Jake pulled Beatrice close and whispered in her ear, "Thank you for giving me a chance when I didn't deserve one. Thank you for challenging me to be better. Thank you for loving me anyway." Beatrice smiled up at him, her eyes shining with joy. "Thank you for choosing me, even when you didn't want to. Thank you for seeing me when no one else did. Thank you for proving that the most beautiful love stories are the ones nobody expects." They danced under the stars while the town celebrated around them, two people who'd found each other against all odds, who transformed a cruel joke into something genuine and lasting. The bet that brought them together became the foundation of a love story Redemption Creek would tell for generations, a reminder that sometimes the greatest treasures are the ones we overlook, that real courage means being vulnerable, and that love, when it's true, can transform everything it touches. Jake Morgan had come to Redemption Creek as a legend, and he stayed as a man. And that, in the end, made all the difference.